Sit down. Wherever you are watching this from, sit down. Because what I am about to tell you is not just a story. It is a wound carved into the memory of a village. A tale so shocking that even today, mothers whisper it to warn their children. So before we begin, take a moment, lean closer, open your ears, and prepare yourself. And do not forget to subscribe to support the telling of stories like this. Because silence, my friend, is how shadows thrive. But when we speak, the truth breathes again. Long ago, there was a village unlike any other. A place of peace, where the sun seemed warmer, and the air carried the sound of children's laughter. The people lived by one golden rule: respect. Respect for elders. Respect for parents. And above all, respect for those who carried the chalk and the book. In this village, the teacher was more than a man with a lesson. He was a guardian of wisdom, second only to a child's own parents. When he walked through the dusty paths, children ran ahead to clear the way. When he spoke, parents listened, nodding in reverence. And when he entered the schoolyard, even the trees seemed to hush, as if knowledge itself had stepped onto the soil. In the evenings, after the last bell had rung, fathers gathered under the baobab tree. Their voices carried one truth: to entrust your child to a teacher is to place your future in safe hands. And so, trust was woven like cloth into the fabric of the village. A trust so deep that questioning it felt like doubting the sun would rise. And among all the teachers, none shone brighter than him. He was the one parents pointed to with pride, the one whose students brought home perfect scores, the one school management held up as the example of discipline, knowledge, and grace. He did not shout. He did not boast. Yet every word from his lips carried weight. And in a place where reputation was everything, his name stood taller than the rest. Mothers prayed their children would land in his classroom. Fathers whispered that to be guided by his lessons was to be blessed for life. And students themselves adored him. His presence was a comfort. His praise was a crown. His discipline, though stern, was always measured with care. They said, if a teacher is the candle that lights the way, then he is the flame that never dims. And so it was. In that village of trust, where respect was sacred, and knowledge was the bridge to the future, he was not just a teacher. He was the teacher. But even the brightest flame, when left unchecked, can cast the darkest shadow. And the shadow he would cast would fall not only on his student, but on another, a young maiden, kind and respectful, living quietly under the same roof. And when the village learned what happened, their trust, the very foundation of their world, would shatter. Sit with me, watch closely, for what is about to unfold will shake even the strongest heart. Sit closer, for this is where the story deepens. If in the village there was honor, then in the school there was reverence. And at the center of it all stood one man, the teacher. Not just any teacher, but the one whose name was carried with pride from home to home, whose footsteps on the dusty schoolyard drew smiles, and whose voice, when lifted, seemed to carry the wisdom of both book and elder. He was gentle with his words, sharp with his knowledge, and patient with the restless minds of children. He had the rare gift of turning lessons into laughter, and laughter into lasting wisdom. Parents fought, not with fists, but with coins and favors, to secure his place as the tutor of their children. For to have him in your home was more than learning, it was prestige. Students adored him. To them, he was more than a man. He was a guide, a storyteller, a lantern in the dim corridors of youth. When he spoke, they listened. When he smiled, they laughed. And when he told stories, they dreamed bigger than the village sky could hold. The school management praised him openly. He is the pride of our community, they said, a treasure among us, a man beyond reproach. And in truth, he seemed perfect, Jew perfect. For every word he spoke landed like music. Every action seemed wrapped in kindness. Every gaze was steady, reassuring, and true. And so he became not just a teacher of children, but an emblem of what the village believed was good. But shadows, do not announce their arrival in the sun. They wait. They grow. They hide behind the brightest smiles. And in every eye, he was perfect. But the perfect mask is the one no one dares to question. Now let us walk beyond the schoolyard, into the home where the story would soon unfold. It was not just any house, but one of stature, a wealthy family, respected, their gates always open to visitors, their name carried with dignity through the village. Theirs was a household where laughter mingled with discipline, and books lined the shelves like silent guardians of wisdom. Every corner breathed order and learning. It was here that the teacher was invited, trusted, and welcomed as one of their own. In this house lived a student, bright as the morning sun, diligent in her studies, eager in her pursuit of knowledge. Her parents believed she carried the future of the family in her small hands. They spared no effort, no expense, to see her excel. To them, education was not just learning, it was legacy. And who better to nurture that legacy than the teacher the village adored? But in the corners of this lively home, where laughter rose and lessons thrived, there was another presence, quiet, almost invisible, the maiden. A house help, no older than her early youth. She moved silently between rooms, carrying water, sweeping floors, preparing meals. Her eyes were always lowered, her words few, her respect unquestioned. In this house, she was not the flower in the garden. She was the soil that nourished it. Unseen, but essential. Humble, but enduring. And yet, fate does not always choose the flower. Sometimes, it bends toward the soil, and destiny had already turned its gaze upon her. She was not the chosen one, not the focus of the family's pride, but in the quiet hum of her silence, her story waited, patient, and inevitable. Times, she was graceful in her humility, kind in her silence, deeply respectful in every word she spoke. Times in her heart, she carried dreams, small, fragile dreams. She longed to learn, to hold books instead of brooms, to write her name instead of merely answering to it. But dreams are luxuries where survival is the only command. And so she buried those desires quietly, like seeds pressed deep beneath the soil, never sure if the rain would come. Times, the household trusted her as if she were one of their own blood. They gave her food, clothing, shelter, and a place in their home. They spoke kindly to her, and she bowed in gratitude each time. Times, but kindness, no matter how sincere, does not erase the lines of hierarchy. In this house, she was never the daughter. She was never the flower in bloom. She was the soil beneath the garden, the unseen root that holds the stem upright. Times they cared for her, yes. But care is not the same as equality. She was always a step behind, always a shadow, always reminded that her role was to serve, nothing more. And so the days passed. She accepted her role with humility, never raising her head too high, never questioning her place. To all who saw her, she was barely there. Just a moving shadow, a girl of chores, a servant whose story was too small to be told. Times, but fate has a strange cruelty, for it is often the ones unseen who are thrust, without warning, into the center of everything. Times she was the quiet one, the forgotten one, the soil. But soon, every eye would turn to her. Every whisper in the village would carry her name. Every silence would echo with her fate. Times she was unseen, until destiny forced her into the light. Times she was unseen, until she became the center of everything. In the rhythm of village life, days often fold into one another. The mornings carried the same scent of dew, the afternoons echoed with the same chatter of children, and the evenings hummed with crickets and distant drums. Stability was the pride of the land, nothing unexpected, nothing out of place. And in the household of learning, this rhythm seemed unbroken. Each day, the teacher arrived at the family's gates with his bag of books and his calm, noble stride. The student would rise to greet him, bowing slightly, as respect demanded. Inside the study room, the lessons unfolded like stories. Mathematics explained with patience, history told with wisdom, literature recited with rhythm. Parents who passed by the door would smile, for they believed their child was in the safest of hands. And not far away, the maiden, always present, yet never truly seen. She swept the courtyard, fetched water, carried trays of food to the table. She moved like the whisper of wind, unnoticed, but essential. To the household, she was part of the background, a trusted pair of hands. To the teacher, at first, she was no more than that, a shadow in motion while he carried out his noble duty. But betrayal does not always strike where eyes are watching. It chooses the blind spot. It grows in silence, unseen, until its weight is unbearable. And so it began, in the smallest of ways. At first, it was nothing more than a moment, his gaze following her footsteps as she crossed the courtyard. She, innocent and unaware, continued her chores. But where others saw only a housemaid, he began to notice something else. The softness in her smile, the humility in her bow, the grace in her movement. A mind diseased by desire always finds its own justifications. Days turned into weeks. Lessons continued as normal. The student under his guidance, the family under the illusion of trust. But a different lesson was being written, one no chalkboard could contain. The lesson of shadows. In folktales, elders warn us, a snake does not hiss in the marketplace for all to hear. It calls in silence beneath the basket. So too, his betrayal did not arrive loudly. It began here, in the quiet routine, the teacher with his student, the maiden with her chores. Everyone felt safe, but safety is often the mask before disaster. They believed the student was under guidance, the maiden under protection. But soon, they would learn, protection is only as strong as the heart of the protector, and his heart had already begun to drift into darkness. In the beginning, her days were simple. Water drawn before sunrise, meals prepared before the rooster's call, her hands busy, her voice soft, her eyes lowered in humility. She lived not for herself, but in service. And in that service, she carried dignity. But dignity is fragile, like glass in the sun. And sometimes, the hand that shatters it is the one the world swore could never harm. In the house of learning, trust was the roof, respect was the pillars, and innocence was the floor on which every step rested. Yet one evening, the walls themselves betrayed the very floor they were meant to protect. The teacher, the one honored above all others, turned his gaze not to the child he was entrusted to guide, but to the maiden, the quiet flower no one thought could be touched. And in that moment, the world shifted. She was not the chosen pupil. She was not the one parents begged him to shape. She was the silent one, sweeping corners, fetching water, bowing her head. But shadows do not respect titles. They enter where light forgets to look. And that night, the shadow entered her world. What happened cannot be told with plain words. For some wounds are not of the body, they are of the soul. It was as if her laughter was stolen, her song silenced, her spirit wrapped in chains no eye could see. She was there the next day, and the day after, yet something was gone forever. Her steps grew heavier, her smile faint, her eyes hollow. She was alive, but the joy of her youth had been taken. The fall of innocence is not a sound we hear. It is the silence that follows. And the greatest shock was not just in what he did. It was in who he chose. Not the student seated before him, shielded by parents' prayers. Not the one the community feared might be misled. But the maiden, the one who washed their clothes, cooked their meals, bowed at their call. The one trusted like blood, but still beneath notice. It was to her that his betrayal fell. What he did was not only against her. It was against the house that welcomed him. Against the family that honored him. Against the school that celebrated him. And against the soul of the entire village. For when innocence is destroyed in silence, it is not one life that suffers. It is a whole people who must carry the shame. That night, the village did not hear a cry. They did not see the shadow move. But in the silence of one humble maiden, a storm was already rising. In the heart of the village, change is noticed not by thunder, but by silence. And when silence falls upon the one who once carried a song, it does not go unnoticed. The maiden who once moved with quiet joy, who greeted each morning with a soft smile and a bowed head, began to fade before their eyes. Her voice, once soft but steady, no longer rose in song. Her steps, once light across the compound, now dragged with unseen weight. The girl who bent with respect, who lived with patience, now carried herself like a broken reed, still standing, but never swaying to the wind again. A shadow had entered her spirit, and it refused to leave. Her parents began to whisper in hushed tones. "She does not laugh anymore," the mother said. "Her eyes, they are not the same," the father muttered. And the neighbors noticed too. When once she would smile as she passed, she now looked down. When once her hands were quick in service, now they trembled. The village began to sense it, though no one could name it. Something had changed. But in the face of questions, she offered no answers. She wore silence like a second skin. The wound that cut her deepest left no mark for the eye to see. And so the whispers grew. Was it sickness? Was it a curse? Or had the burdens of service broken her spirit? No one dared to ask her directly, for her silence carried a weight heavier than words. Fear bound her tongue. Shame sealed her lips. The one place she might have cried for help was the very place she feared most. For who could she tell? Who would believe that the one celebrated as teacher, leader, and guide could bring such darkness? So she carried her silence alone, hidden like a flame beneath ashes. The world saw only the surface. A girl who grew quieter. A girl who lost her smile. A girl who seemed suddenly older than her years. But beneath that silence, storms were raging, storms unseen, storms unheard. And the greatest tragedy was that no one yet knew. Not her parents. Not her neighbors. Not even the child she cared for every day. The truth slept in shadows, waiting to be revealed. She was there, yet not present. Alive, yet hollow. Smiling no more, singing no more. The maiden had become a ghost in her own home. And the whispers in the village grew louder. Because everyone could feel it. The girl was shattered. But none yet knew why. In villages such as this, silence is rarely silent. It carries weight. It drifts like smoke, curling into corners, slipping beneath doors, settling into ears that pretend not to hear, but cannot escape. And so, whispers began. They whispered about the young maiden. How her laughter had vanished. How her eyes, once bright, no longer rose to meet the dawn. How she moved through the house like a shadow, careful not to be seen, not to be heard. The student, once close to her like a sister, noticed first. She would ask softly, "Are you well?" But the maiden only nodded, forcing a smile that never reached her soul. It was not the answer of truth, but of fear. The family began to wonder. Mothers and fathers notice when the rhythm of their home changes. They saw the girl who once sang, while working now moving as if under a curse. They whispered behind closed doors, asking, what happened to her? And yet, while suspicion hung in the air like a storm refusing to break, the teacher walked the village paths untouched. His robe clean, his smile warm, his voice sweet as honey. In the daylight, he was still the pride of the school, the shining example to every child and parent alike. But what is more dangerous than a man wearing two faces? One of honor, one of betrayal. A man praised beneath the sun, while carrying shadows in his hands. In the village of trust, where words travel faster than the wind, truth had not yet spoken. But the whispers were growing louder. Trust is like clay in the hands of the potter. Strong, beautiful, but fragile. Sometimes, it takes only the faintest pressure, the smallest crack, for the whole vessel to weaken. And in that house, the first crack appeared. It began with a neighbor. She was not searching for secrets, only passing by the window, carrying her basket of yams. But her eyes caught something unusual. The teacher lingering too long where the maiden worked. His words soft, his gaze too heavy for a man of honor. She said nothing, not then. For who would believe such a thought? Who would dare stain the name of a man so respected? Yet, the image clung to her heart, heavy as a stone. The second crack came with a name. A simple name spoken at supper. The teacher's name. And in that moment, the maiden's eyes welled with tears she could not stop. She lowered her head, covering her face quickly. But the silence spoke louder than words. And those who sat nearby felt the air shift. They glanced at one another, asking silently what no one dared to voice aloud. Why would his name bring sorrow, if not for something hidden, something forbidden? From that night on, suspicion began to grow, quiet, invisible, yet alive, like weeds sprouting in the cracks of a courtyard stone. It was not yet accusation. It was not yet truth. It was only a shadow of doubt, the kind people push aside because to believe it would be to admit that the sun itself had burned the crops. The village could not yet speak it. For to accuse him was to wound themselves. To question the man they had raised up as light was to admit that light itself can blind. And so, they chose silence. But silence cannot heal what festers in the dark. Secrets can only hide for so long. Like smoke curling under a door, they eventually find a way out. And in that house, the truth broke free, not in a shout, but in a whisper trembling with fear. One night, when the weight was too much to bear, the maiden turned to the only soul she trusted, the student, or perhaps another servant girl who shared her chores. Her voice shook, each word like a stone dragged from the depths of her chest. And the words that spilled out shattered innocence forever. It was not the student he was teaching. It was the one no one was watching. The shock was unbearable. For the student, if it was she, her world tilted, knowing the man her parents revered was a predator. For the servant, if it was she, her heart raced, knowing this was a wound too deep to hide. Either way, the truth was out. And once truth breathes air, it cannot be smothered again. The family was torn apart. At first, disbelief. The father's voice rising, not him. Never him. The mother clutching her chest in silence, as if the earth itself had shifted beneath her. Anger burned. Shame followed. And beneath it all, sorrow heavy as stone. In that household, respect had turned into ruin. The name that once brought honor now brought only pain. The teacher was still smiling in public, still wrapped in the cloth of holiness. But inside those walls, his mask had fallen. And the family knew. The village would soon know. And nothing, would ever be the same. Truth does not stay caged. Like the Harmattan wind sweeping dust across the land, it spreads, filling every corner, touching every life. The revelation of what happened in that household spread like wildfire. At first, it was whispers. A neighbor, overhearing cries at night. A cousin, who had seen the maiden's sudden silence. A servant girl who could not hold the secret any longer. And soon, the whispers became voices. The voices became gasps. The gasps became shouts that echoed across the village. Parents were horrified. Mothers clutched their daughters close, their eyes darting with fear. Fathers clenched their fists, muttering curses under their breath. For in this land, a teacher is not merely a guide of knowledge. A teacher is a second father, a shepherd, a guardian of children. And now, that trust had been shattered by the very man who was supposed to protect. Students, young and wide-eyed, were confused. Their teacher, the one who spoke of discipline, of morals, of the path to wisdom, was now at the center of a storm. They whispered among themselves in corridors, some refusing to believe, others trembling in silent understanding. Elders were furious. For them, this was not only the crime of a man, it was a betrayal of the community. A daughter of the soil, they said, was defiled under our very noses. And the shame was not hers alone. It was theirs. The soil itself had been wounded. But the village was divided. Some believed with burning certainty. They pointed to the maiden's silence, her haunted eyes, her broken songs. Others, loyal to the teacher's long reputation, cried out, "It cannot be true. This is jealousy. This is a lie to bring down a good man." And so the question spread from hut to hut, from firepit to firepit. Was this the truth? Or was this envy dressed as rumor? How could the man who taught their children, who prayed in their gatherings, who smiled with such grace, be the same man accused of such evil? The betrayal was not just in the act itself, it was in the fracture of trust. Because when a teacher sins against one child, he sins against the whole village, against the soil that raised him, against the ancestors watching in silence. And so the village stood divided. Some demanded punishment. Some demanded proof. But all of them knew one thing: the peace they once held had been broken. The teacher's shadow loomed larger now, not as a guide of wisdom, but as a storm tearing through their hearts. The day the truth stood still, the sun itself seemed to dim, for the man once carried as a crown of pride was now cast down as a burden of shame. Times, whispers turned into words, words into shouts. And soon, the story that had begun in shadows was now on every tongue. Parents who once brought gifts to thank him, now turned their faces away. The man who once walked through the market like a king now walked like a ghost. Times, the children who once crowded around him with laughter and questions, now crossed to the other side of the path. The schoolyard, once filled with his stories, was emptied of his voice. Parents whispered to one another, "How can we leave our children in his care, when he has wounded another man's child?" Times, even the school, which once called him the pride of the community, now lowered its head. Teachers whispered behind closed doors, elders shook their heads in disbelief. No shield could protect him anymore. His name, once lifted in praise, became the stone children used to mock. Times, he began to walk differently, slower, shoulders bent, eyes always searching the ground. The man who once looked everyone in the eye now dared not lift his gaze. In the marketplace, in the church, in the gatherings, he was no longer one of them. He was an outcast. And still, he never confessed. Times, to the villagers, his crime was more than against the maiden, it was against them all. Against their trust. Against their children's future. Against the bond between teacher and community that had stood for generations. And in that betrayal, he fell harder than any thief, any criminal, any stranger ever could. Times, and so he lingered in his own silence. Neither denying nor admitting, he walked with the shadow of his act. The house that once welcomed him shut its gates. The paths that once carried him proudly now bent under the weight of his shame. The beloved teacher was gone. In his place, a fallen man. In the silence that followed his fall, the story turned back to her. The maiden. The daughter of the soil. The one whose life had been carved open by betrayal. Times, she walked with her head low, but her feet never stopped moving. Her body carried the weight of wounds unseen, yet she refused to let the ground swallow her whole. To the villagers she was now a symbol, but to herself, she was only a girl trying to survive the storm. Times, every corner of the village reminded her of him. The school where his voice once echoed, the path where he once greeted her with false warmth, the gatherings where elders once praised his name. Betrayal is not only an act, it is a shadow that lingers long after the hand has struck. Times, she did not speak of it. Not to her mother. Not to her sisters. Not even to the night sky that held her tears. Her silence was not weakness, but survival. For every word carried the risk of being doubted, shamed, or scarred anew. Times. The villagers, though furious at him, did not always know how to face her. Some pitied her. Some avoided her. And some, in whispers too sharp for her ears, wondered aloud if she had tempted the teacher herself. In her struggle, she carried not only pain, but the burden of suspicion. Times, but she refused to vanish. With trembling hands she returned to the fields, helping her mother plant seeds. With trembling steps she returned to the marketplace, selling small goods. And with trembling breath she whispered to herself each morning, "I am still here." Times. In every quiet step, in every hidden tear, she carried what he could not bury, the truth. She was not only the victim of his betrayal, she was the living witness that no lie could silence. And though her voice remained hushed, her very existence spoke louder than any denial. She endured. Broken, yet unbroken. Wounded, yet walking. And in her endurance, she carried not only her own struggle, but the conscience of an entire village. In the ruins of trust, a village does not only mourn the past, it must confront its future. What happens when the very hands meant to protect become the ones that wound? What do we learn when the brightest torch, carried wrongly, burns the hut it was meant to light? Times, teachers are given children, not only to instruct, but to shape. Parents open their doors, surrendering their sons and daughters to a figure they believe will stand as guardian, as guide. But when trust is betrayed, the wound is not only personal, it is cultural, generational, communal. Power, if misused, is poison. A title can blind, a reputation can silence questions, and the respect of the community can cloak even the darkest of deeds. The villagers had seen this, how one man's borrowed authority became the shield for his betrayal. Times, the elders say, even the brightest torch can set fire to the hut if misshelled. A torch is a blessing, but in the wrong hands, it consumes instead of guiding. The teacher had once been the brightest flame of the village. But he held it carelessly, and the fire spread to an innocent soul. Times, families must remember, trust is a gift, but vigilance is a duty. To leave children in another's care is an act of faith, but faith must never be blind. For silence is what predators crave most. And silence, if left unbroken, feeds the shadows. Times, a society that does not question its guardians is a society preparing its own betrayal. It is not enough to honor titles or praise achievements. Communities must ask, are the children safe? Are the weak protected? Are the powerful held accountable? The maiden's struggle was more than her own story. It was the lesson the village could not ignore. She became the silent reminder that trust without watchfulness is fragile, and that even the brightest torch must be held with care, lest the whole hut burn. And so, from ashes came warning. From betrayal came teaching. And the story of the teacher and the maiden was no longer theirs alone, it became a lesson for the living, a fire the next generation must guard against. In the end, no one remembered the teacher for the lessons he once gave. His chalk faded, his voice vanished, his blackboard turned grey with dust. What remained was not his wisdom, but his betrayal. Times. He could have been honored. His name could have been written in the song of generations. But instead, the village spoke his name with bitterness, a warning, not a blessing. Times. The maiden chose silence, but silence does not mean absence. Her silence became a mirror the village could not look away from. It was the silence of all who had ever been betrayed by the ones they trusted most. Times, the elders would say, trust is the heaviest gift. It cannot be carried carelessly. It must not be broken. For when it shatters, it does not fall upon one soul alone, it falls upon the whole community. Times, years later, people still whisper the story at dusk. Mothers told their daughters. Fathers warned their sons. It was no longer about the maiden or the teacher. It was about the fragile bond that ties one soul to another. A bond that, once broken, leaves cracks that time cannot fully seal. This story must not be forgotten. For forgetting is the first step to repeating. If you have walked with us through their silence, through their lesson, through their pain, then let their story live on. Share it, speak it, carry it forward, so that no torch again burns the hut it was meant to guide.